Hi everyone, I hope you're all keeping well. I'm just going to attempt, with the help of my daughter Catherine, to create a YouTube video to explain a little bit about the different types of cost, and then to be able to split those costs into direct costs or indirect costs. So in costing, which is our next exam, it's very different than than financial accounting because there are no debits and credits. But what you are dealing with are costs. And there are three elements of cost: materials, labour, and expense. So we have materials, labour, and expenses. I think I've written materials twice. Okay. Each material is further split into a direct material or an indirect material. Labour is split into direct labour or indirect labour. And expenses are split into direct expenses or indirect. So it's key to know three elements of cost: materials, labour, and expenses. And each of those elements is further subdivided into direct or indirect. As you know, materials are things which are used to make the product. So, if the material can be directly traced back to that product, we call it direct. So if you were making a chair, you would need some tubular legs, some sponge for the seat, some material to cover the sponge, some wheels for the chair, and maybe a handle so that the chair can move up and down. All of those things would be in each and every chair, and each chair might take 1 metre of material, 1 metre of sponge, 4 wheels and 1 lever. So all of those items could be directly traced back to the product. So, also there are indirect materials. For instance, when you make a chair, you might need drops of oil, grease, lubricants to make the wheels spin better, to make the chair swivel better, whatever. But it would be very difficult to trace back, oh, this chair had 2 drops of oil, this chair only needed 1, this chair had 3 bits of grease, and this chair only had 4. So those costs are very difficult to trace back to the unit of production, and so we call them indirect. Labour are the people who make the product, or people who work. So direct labour are the people who actually make the product. They construct it, they build it, they assemble it, they put it together. They are the doer, the builder, the worker. They make the product. So the person assembling the chair is the direct worker. The person building the house is the direct worker. However, the people sitting in the office doing all the paperwork, the factory supervisor, the factory canteen workers, the factory cleaners, they're all valid workers, but they're not putting the product together. They're not assembling, they're not making, they're not doing. So all of that labour is called indirect labour. Expenses come with everything. We have to pay rent, we have to pay maintenance, we have to pay repairs, we have to pay insurance. If an expense can be traced directly back to the product, we will call it a direct expense. For instance, I'm making a chair and Mr. Z designed that chair. So I have to ask him, Mr. Z, I really like the design of your chair. I'd like to make it. Am I able to use your design? And he'll say to me, yes, that's fine. But for every chair that you make, you pay me £1. So that would be a royalty. So each chair that I make, I can directly link £1 of royalty charge to that chair. Other expenses, such as heat and light, rates, rent, repairs, would be very difficult to trace back to the unit of production. Therefore, we tend to say that these expenses are indirect. Okay, so 3 elements of cost: materials, labour and expenses. Each of those further subdivided into direct or indirect. Direct are the material or the labour or the expenses which can be traced directly back to the product. Indirect expenses are what we call very often overheads, and they are not traced directly back to the product. Okay? If you have your costing books ready, we can go to page 17. If you don't, then I will talk you through this little example. We've got a restaurant, and we've got to decide whether these following costs are going to be direct or indirect. And we'd like to also say whether they're indirect or direct: labour, materials or expenses. So we are operating as a restaurant. So the first cost that we have is wages of the cleaner. Firstly, we could say that wages would be labour, and we could say that a cleaner would be indirect. They are not the assembler or the producer. Secondly, we've got the cost of heating the restaurant. That would be an expense. If you think about the product of a restaurant, it is a meal, or a cover, a meal that you serve to somebody. So it would be very difficult to break down the cost of heating the restaurant and apportion that to every single meal. Therefore, it's not easily traced back to the product. So the cost of heating the restaurant would be an expense, and it would be an indirect expense. The wages of the chefs, these people are workers, it's labour, but they are the makers of the meal. They are the constructors, the builders, the doers. Therefore, the wages of the chefs we would class as direct labour. Telephone charges. Again, these are expenses. But it would be very difficult to say how much of a telephone bill went to product A, how much should go to product B, how much should go to product C. Therefore, we call it an indirect expense, as it's not easily traced back to the product. Paper table covers and napkins. These again would be expenses. Well, maybe actually, let's have a think. They could be materials, couldn't they? Because they're part of the serving of the meal. However, they are not easily traced back to the dinner or the pudding or the soup or whatever. So therefore, they would be indirect materials. The cost of ingredients for the meals. Okay, the meat, the chicken, the fish, the vegetables, the sugar, the salt, the pepper, the butter, the margarine, the oil, all of those things, they would be involved in creating the product itself. Therefore, those materials would be direct materials. Cleaning materials we would class as expenses. And, you know, it might be difficult to know how much Jif or how much washing up liquid went to washing each plate for each meal. Therefore, it would be very difficult to trace it back to the unit of production. And so we would need to call it an indirect expense. Advertising costs, also an expense. We might spend 40 or 50,000 pounds advertising on the television, but it would be difficult to link that cost back to each dinner or each meal or each pudding. So again, advertising costs would be an expense and it would be indirect. A maintenance contract for ovens, again, we would have a standard charge that we have to pay, and that would be classed as an indirect expense, because if we paid £200 to service the oven, how much would we know? How would we know how much of that £200 should go to pudding A, pudding B, or dinner C? So again, maintenance contract for ovens would be an indirect expense, and wages of the waiters and the waitresses. We would say here that they are labour, and because they are directly involved in serving the product, they are delivering that product to the table, then they are the direct workers, direct labour. Thank you. Right, I would like us to try some exercises on this. We're now working in a bakery, and we've got to decide whether the following costs are direct or indirect. So flour used to bake the bread. That is a material, and because it's directly involved in the product, it is a direct material. The rent of the bakery. I'm just giving you a chance to think. Hopefully you'll be telling me that that is an indirect expense. Rent is an expense, and it's difficult to trace back to each loaf of bread, therefore, or cake, therefore it's an indirect expense. The wages of the bakers. I hope you're telling me that they are direct labour. The bakers are labour, and they are the makers, the producers of the product. Direct labour. Repairs to baking machinery. Repairs would be expenses, and it will be difficult to cost the broken oven door to every cake or pie or loaf of bread that the baker produces. So therefore, the repairs would be an indirect expense. Currants used in the buns, in the cakes, would be a material, and as they are directly involved in the product and can be traced back to that product easily, then they would be direct materials. Wages of the bakery cleaner. Is labour. They are cleaners, they are not producers or assemblers or constructors, therefore it is indirect labour. Insurance of the bakery. Insurance is an expense, and because the insurance bill would be difficult to link to each loaf of bread or bun or cake, then we will call it an indirect expense. The salary of the production manager is labour. But the manager is the manager. He swans around and he tells people what to do. He does not produce or assemble or create himself. Therefore, any manager or supervisor would always be indirect labour. Now, obviously this is my first attempt. I've gone through the difference between the two. I will upload some exercises now for you to practice, and perhaps then you could send them in to me, or I can do another little video and go through the answers. But if you just let me know whether you found this useful or helpful at all, because obviously I'll get a bit better at it and I'll have stuff ready to hand if you feel that this will be an okay for us to move forward. And we can break it down into, little topics like costs, indirect, direct, overheads, how costs behave. So we can break it down into little manageable chunks if you just give me an idea that this will be an okay way for us to try and go forward. Okay, thanks a lot. I will upload some questions for you based on this, but have a listen through again and make sure you understand the 3 elements of cost and what the difference between a direct and an indirect cost really is. Thanks. Speak to you again soon. Hope you're all keeping well. Bye-bye.